Well, I have prepared some remarks, but of course, one of the things about a presentation like Gianluca's is that it provokes further thought. The first thought it provoked in me when he spoke of the perfect number was, of course, that anyone who's read Eduardo O'Gorman, a Mexican historian of a previous generation, will know that the theological impact of the discovery of the Americas as a fourth continent was deeply upsetting, because it upset the correspondence between the Trinity and the continents. So we're in trouble from the start. And, 4 is a bad number. But a second thing that I noticed in passing was when Gianluca said that a foreign policy that was based wholly on ideology would be utopia or utopian. And of course, one's mind immediately goes back to someone of the same generation as O'Gorman, I think, roughly, which is Karl Mannheim, one of whose books was called Ideology and Utopia. And what he had in mind was that here were bodies of ideas which were intended to govern politics and social life, with ideology being the conservative force and utopia the progressive or changing force. This was changed by E.H. Carr, on whom I've written in the past, one of the founding figures of international relations in this country, into an opposition between utopia and realism, because Carr knew very well that his audience, his target audience of sort of upper middle class policymakers in Britain in the 1930s didn't like the word ideology and would not respond well to it, but they certainly thought of themselves as realists. Well, so much by way of preface. I have to say it's the fate of most books on foreign policy, in my experience, to date rather rapidly. To the extent that they deal with recent events, current regimes and policymakers, they typically have a life of a decade or so. But I think there's a fair chance that this particular volume will have a longer life. The empirical richness of its chapters, written by a set of excellent scholars, will fade a little with the passage of time, or become less attractive. But the historical depth and analytical structure that the editors have brought to the volume as a whole, also their success in persuading their contributors to reflect these qualities, which is no mean task, these bode well for the future. Now, since I'm a historian, I'm generally generously introduced as being expert on both history and current affairs, but I got slightly bored with current affairs a few years ago and reverted more purely to history. After reading the Financial Times for 35 years, I just sort of stopped at a certain point. I now find I should have been reading Wall Street Journal, where they would have actually paid me, Anyway, since I'm a historian, I hope it will be acceptable for me to concentrate on this primary distinction around which, this is a non sequitur. I also studied philosophy. I think this is probably the reason for the concentration on the primary distinction around which the book is organized between ideology and pragmatism. And to me, as a historian, of course, this brings immediately to mind the way in which the Soviet Union behaved, was perceived after the revolution in 17 for the next 2, 3, 4 decades. It was always a question of the extent to which Soviet policy was ideological, the extent to which it was pragmatic. This is perhaps a great historical 20th century case that we should have in mind. But we'll go further back to the French Revolution, the same issues about whether the foreign policy was ideological or pragmatic. Now, I think the great virtue of this distinction between ideology and pragmatism is that it is thought-provoking. It's not that it's right, it's that it's thought-provoking. It's evident that the contributors to the book have found it so, and they're not even in their interpretation and treatment of it. I believe that readers also will find this a very provocative distinction. I start with this positive remark because I also have some comments which I wouldn't say were negative, but they certainly put in question the utility and character of this distinction. One thought it provoked, which I've never had before, and I really should have thought of this before, is that there's something awkward in the English language here. There are two adjectives that correspond to the noun pragmatism. The first is pragmatist, which is really a noun being used adjectively, and the second is pragmatic. Now, in common usage, pragmatic, the second of these, suggests a trial and error way of going about things, responsive to conditions, unconcerned about the long run, perhaps even expedient, muddling along. The second, pragmatist, suggests attachment to a philosophical school that runs from William James, John Dewey, through Richard Rorty, to contemporary philosophers such as Hugh Price, for whom the longing to ground knowledge in secure ontology and ground action in foundational moral principles is regarded as a fool's errand. The best we can hope for, this school tend to hold, the best we can hope for is to establish the mutual consistency of our knowledge claims. Turning to ethics, ethics for Dewey came down to a lifelong process in which intentionally formed habits, such as the disciplines of a military or medical professional, are substituted for mere custom, and personality is in a constant state of development. What had passed for principles in the past, backed by divine or other authority, may remain useful guidelines, but are deprived of their authority and status. And recently I've been working with a very interesting postgraduate student who is, as it happens, a naval officer also. And we've been thinking about the just war, concerning which there's been an enormous amount of talk in recent years. And all of that talk has been very much about meeting certain criteria, fulfilling certain conditions in order to justify certain sorts of action. But the pragmatist approach, which he is pursuing, I won't name him because he's an intelligence officer in a certain force, but the line he's been developing is that a pragmatist view of what's happening when a country goes to war should have at its heart the notion of what sort of country this is becoming through its actions. So it's very like the individual view of Dewey, but we extend it to the political community and say, well, what sort of country do we think we are if we take these actions? Now, this is a little bit of a digression, but not much. When I said that I found this book thought-provoking, I really meant it, as you could just see. It forced me to think what a pragmatist foreign policy might look like, and it would, as I've just suggested, I think, cut ideology and national identity down to size, but I think it would also entail a recognition that diplomacy has the character that Richard Rorty, the most eminent of the American pragmatists of recent years, captures in the concept of conversation, uses it in a technical sense. When two interlocutors operate within thought worlds and with languages, in the same natural language as with British and North Americans, when they operate with thought worlds and languages that are not wholly commensurate, that don't map nicely into each other, conversation is still possible, but that absence of commensurability sets limits to communication. There is always a gap. I think successful diplomacy and foreign policy require recognition of this, and I think that the authors in this volume recognize this in the repeated acknowledgement that many Latin American countries run dual or triple foreign policies. The multiplicity of policy may stem from switching between different concepts of the nation and its mission. One thinks of Brazil, which has been variously perceived by commentators and by its own policymakers, and there's discussion of this in the book, as perhaps a regional hegemon, perhaps at times during the Cold War a sub-imperialist power, perhaps more these days a middle power, and all of these have been possible ways of thinking of the country. I note in passing at this point that ideology in this volume often includes national identity somehow, as well as sets of political beliefs like liberalism or Marxism. Alternatively,